The sun beat down on the dusty road as Sister Maria gripped the steering wheel of the convent's old van with a worried look. She was transporting a small supply of goods bound for a charity project in a remote town. It was an important trip, and time was of the essence. However, the engine began to cough ominously. Moments later, with one final jolt, the van came to a complete stop. Sister Maria stepped out, watching the smoke rising from the hood with a mix of anger and determination. After a few moments of thought, she decided to push the car to the closest repair shop, visible in the distance along the road. It wasn't an easy job, but Maria was not a woman who gave up easily. Finally, she arrived in front of a rusted sign that read, "Marcos Garage, Repairs and More." The sound of a bell announced her arrival. Inside, a young guy with a grease-streaked face and a cocky attitude turned toward her. "Well, this is a surprise," Marcos said with a goofy smile. "You don't see a nun in a place like this every day." Maria, accustomed to handling unusual events, answered calmly. "Good morning. Our van broke down a little ways back. We need help to reach the goal." Marco approached, examining the car with a critical eye. "This thing's a real piece of junk," he said frankly. Then, with a tone that veered between teasing and fascinated, he added, "Didn't expect nuns to drive, let alone take on such bold trips." Maria offered a faint smile. "When there's a job to be done, there are no limits." Marco laughed, shaking his head. "Let's see what I can do," he said, popping open the hood with a determined move. As he began inspecting the engine, Marco threw a string of playful comments at Maria, clearly amused by her appearance in such an unlikely setting. "So sister, what made you decide to become, well, a nun? Don't tell me life outside the convent wasn't interesting enough." Maria met his eyes quietly. "Everyone finds their own way, Marco. Mine started in a moment of great pain, but it led me to a peace I had never known." Marco was moved by the serenity in her answer, but didn't let it show. "Interesting," he mumbled, returning his attention to the engine. After a few minutes, Marco turned to her with a cheeky grin. "How about getting your hands dirty? You might learn something useful." Maria raised an eyebrow, amused. "Why not? If it helps get this van going again, I'm ready." The scene that followed was almost hilarious. Maria, with her delicate hands and clean habit, crouched beside Marco, trying to follow his instructions as she fumbled with the tools. Marco, initially amused, began to notice her drive. "I didn't expect you to be this tough," Marco said, showing her how to tighten a bolt. Maria smiled. "Life needs strength, Marco, even when it seems impossible to move forward." Her words struck something deep inside him. For a moment, his cocky attitude relaxed. "I have to admit," he said, almost under his breath, "I've never met anyone like you." Maria looked at him, noticing the change in his face. "It's never too late to change, Marco," she said softly. Their talk was broken by the sound of the engine roaring back to life. Marco grinned triumphantly. "There you go, sister. Your old junk is back in action. I'd say it's ready for another surprise." Maria laughed, then added sincerely, "Thank you, Marco. You don't know how much this means to us." As Marco wiped his hands clean, he seemed thoughtful. "You know, sister," he said after a moment, "I'm not the kind of guy who believes in magic. Life's been tough enough to make me lose faith a long time ago." Maria studied him closely. "Sometimes, Marco, it's in the darkest moments that we find the light. You're never too far gone to turn back." Marco didn't reply, but her words seemed to echo deeply within him. The van's engine was running once again, but Sister Maria stayed by the vehicle, watching Marco as he worked on the finishing touches. Despite the confidence that surrounds him, there was something about him that seemed fragile, almost hidden beneath his sarcasm and sharp comments. "Thank you again, Marco," Maria said with a sincere smile. "You don't know how important this trip was for us." Marco nodded, wiping his hands with a grease-stained rag. "Well, I'm not used to getting such beautiful thank yous. Usually people just want to pay the price and leave." Maria chuckled softly. "Sometimes a sincere thank you is worth more than any gift." Marco stared at her for a moment, then looked away, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it. Staying so upbeat. I can't imagine looking at the world that way." Maria took the chance to sit on a wooden bench near the garage. "And how do you see it, Marco?" she asked with real interest. Marco sighed, crossing his arms and leaning against the van. "Like a place full of failures. The more you try to do something good, the more life knocks you down. I stopped trying a long time ago. Maria didn't reply right away, letting the silence make a space for Marco to continue. "I wasn't always like this," he revealed finally. "I used to have dreams. I wanted to open a big shop, hire people, build something of my own. But then, things went wrong. Debts, people who wronged me, an accident that made me lose everything. And now I'm here, putting together bits just to barely pay the bills." Maria looked at him with concern, not interrupting. "That must have been hard," she said softly. "Hard? It's a disaster," Marco responded with a bitter smile. "Every time I try to get back up, something pulls me down again. Eventually, you give up. It's easier to live this way, no plans, no hopes." Maria shook her head, her tones soft but strong. "It's never easier to give up, Marco. It's just less scary. But life without hope is like turning off a car engine and expecting it to keep going." Marco chuckled, but there was a hint of earnestness in his laugh. "Nice metaphor, sister. Not bad for someone who doesn't even know how to tighten a bolt." They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in thought. Marco stared at the van while Maria quietly watched him. Finally, Marco broke the silence. "And you? Why did you become a nun? Don't tell me it was an easy choice." Maria gave a faint smile. "No, it wasn't. My family didn't understand my choice, and even I wasn't sure what I was doing. But it was something I felt deep down. I'd lost someone I cared about deeply, and that pain left me empty. Then I found that dedicating myself to others could fill that hole in a way nothing and no one else ever could." Marco looked at her, struck by the honesty of her words. "So your power is God, huh?" Maria nodded. "Exactly. And when the engine stops, there's always a way to restart it. You just have to find the right power." Marco sat quietly for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know if I believe that. I don't even know if there's a God. But I've got to admit, what you're saying makes sense." Maria smiled. "It's never too late to find out, Marco, and you don't have to do it alone." Their talk was interrupted by the sound of another car arriving. It was a small truck loaded with supplies going to the nearby town. The driver, an old man, waved excitedly at Sister Maria. "Need a hand?" he asked. "Thank you, but we're just about ready to leave," Maria answered. As the truck pulled away, Marco turned to Maria with a serious look. "You really believe everything has a reason, don't you?" "We don't always see it right away," Maria said. "But yes, I think that everything, even the struggles, has value. And you, Marco, are stronger than you think. You haven't lost your engine. You just need to know how to restart it." Marco smiled barely, brushing his brow as if trying to shake off a thought. "Maybe you're right. Or maybe you're just good at saying the right things. Either way, thank you for listening." Before Maria climbed into the van, Marco approached her and gave her a small item he'd found among his tools. It was an old piece of metal, shiny and well kept. "It's not a rosary," he said with a half smile, "but maybe it can remind you of today. Even nuns need an artificial pet, right?" Maria laughed, accepting the gift. "Thank you, Marco. I'll keep it with me." As the van roared to life and pulled away, Marco stood watching it disappear, holding the small rosary Maria had left with him before leaving. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. Standing in front of his garage, Marco stayed still, holding the rosary tightly in his palm. He couldn't explain why, but the simple object held a weight of feeling he didn't fully understand. Staring down the empty road, he found himself thinking if that meeting truly had a greater meaning, or was just a coincidence. That evening, as he locked up the garage, Marco couldn't stop thinking about Maria's words. "It's never too late to restart." The phrase repeated in his mind like an engine trying to turn over after years of being idle. With a mix of interest and doubt, he chose to try something different. He opened the dusty box at his workbench and pulled out an old notebook, the one he had used years ago to jot down his goals and plans for the garage he had wanted to build. Flipping through the leaves, Marco was filled with a bittersweet mix of memories and sorrow. Every project, every sketch, and every idea reflected a part of himself that he had abandoned when life took an unexpected turn. But as he stared at those words, he also felt a tiny spark of hope. "If I can fix broken tools every day," he mumbled to himself, "maybe I can fix myself too." In the days that followed, Marco began making small but important changes. Instead of focusing solely on quick, badly paid fixes, he started spending more time with his customers, listening to their stories and trying to help beyond the technical work. He also made a bold choice to contact an old supplier and restart a project he had abandoned years ago, special tools that would make his garage more efficient. It's a risk, he thought, but what's the point of life if you don't even try to improve? One day, while working on a particularly tricky engine, he heard the bell jingle at the garage door. He turned, expecting to see just another customer, but his heart skipped a beat when he recognized Sister Maria. "Maria," he shouted, dropping his wrench. "I didn't expect to see you again." Maria smiled, holding a small bag in her hands. "I was going through on my way to another job and thought I'd stop by to check on you. How are things going?" Marco walked over. His face lit up with a real smile. "Better, I think. I've started rethinking what I really want to do with this place. And you know what? You were right. It's never too late to start over." Maria studied him closely, noticing the change in his stance and tone. "I'm glad to hear that, Marco. Sometimes all it takes is a spark to start a new fire." Marco nodded, then paused, looking at her with a more serious face. "I have to tell you something. I'm not sure I've found my way back to believing in God, but that rosary you left with me, I carry it everywhere. I don't know why, but it gives me a sense of calm. Like I'm not completely alone." Maria smiled, putting a hand on Marco's shoulder. "It doesn't matter what you call it, Marco. Faith can take many forms. What's important is remembering that you're never truly abandoned." Before Maria left, Marco pulled out the notebook he had started using again. He showed it to her with a touch of pride. "These were my dreams once. I thought I'd lost them, but now I'm trying to bring them back to life. And you know what? You're the reason I believe it's possible." Maria looked at him with eyes full of approval. "I didn't do anything, Marco. You found the strength within yourself. I just lit a spark. Now it's up to you to keep the light burning." After that meeting, Marco poured himself fully into his idea. Over time, he turned his basement into not just a workplace, but a hub for helping the community. He began giving free mechanics lessons to struggling kids and repairing cars for those who couldn't afford it. Whenever someone asked why he did it, he would smile and simply say, "Because every engine, no matter how broken, can be fixed." A year later, Marco got a letter from the nuns. It was signed by Sister Maria, thanking him for inspiring others to follow his example. Attached to the letter was a small wrench-shaped pendant, etched with the words, "Faith and commitment are the best tools." Marco hung the charm next to the rosary, giving it a place of honor in his shop. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of the meeting that had changed his life and how a simple nun had taught him the value of hope and determination. Every life, like every engine, can be fixed with the right amount of patience, faith, and devotion. Sometimes, all it takes is one encounter to ignite a spark and totally change our path.
Subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell notification for more stories like this, and give this video a thumbs up. Click on this next interesting story.